Good afternoon, everybody. Good morning to those of you who are joining us from Europe as well. Indeed, welcome to Your Excellencies. We have several ambassadors joining us on this webinar today, where we are talking about sustainable infrastructure development in ASEAN. The title is Driving ASEAN Sustainable Infrastructure Agenda Forward. We have a very esteemed panel with us, which our moderator will introduce shortly. Our moderator today is Martin Hayes. He's the Vice Chairman of the EU-ASEAN Business Council, and he's also President of Bosch for Southeast Asia and their Managing Director for Singapore, a role he's been fulfilling since 2011, and a founding member as well of the EU-ASEAN Business Council. So I think with that, I will hand over the reins to Martin, and he can introduce the rest of his panel, and we can get the discussion underway.
So, yes, thank you very much, Chris. And look at that, as if by lightning, Igor joins us just at the right time. So a warm welcome to everybody on this, our EU-ABC webinar on the topic of driving ASEAN's sustainable infrastructure forward. So first, let me say a few words to set the stage for today's webinar before I pass it then over to the panelists. As you all know, ASEAN is one of the fastest growing regions in the world, with a GDP averaging 5% in the past few years. Although COVID-19 pandemic will without a doubt slow down its economic development, it's expected still that ASEAN's future will be a bright one. And that will be due to its increasing middle class, a young population, a technological advancements being made innovative, and a massive expansion of the infrastructure across the region, especially in urban areas. At the same time, strong economic development coupled with urbanisation puts a strain on the existing infrastructure and comes with negative effects such as air and water pollution, traffic congestion, and rising inequality. Based on that, it's key to design ASEAN's infrastructure expansion in a green, smart, and sustainable way. Both public and private sector need to work closely together on this goal, and that's why we're very pleased to have both of those sections and viewpoints with us today on our webinar. And on that note, let me introduce our four panelists. They are firstly His Excellency Igor Dreismans, the EU's ambassador to ASEAN, who will give us some insights on what sustainable infrastructure means to the EU and ASEAN and how EU can support ASEAN with its sustainable agenda. And we welcome Igor, who's come in from Jakarta. Thank you, Igor. Next, pleased to welcome Cao Juan Tiang, or for me and for others, JT. He's the Executive Director of Infrastructure Asia as our second panelist. Infrastructure Asia is an initiative which has been set up by Enterprise Singapore and the Monetary Authority of Singapore that advises governments and companies on infrastructure projects across Asia. Our third speaker today is Johan de Villiers, the Country Managing Director of ABB, and Johan is also a board member of the EU-ABC and our Treasurer. ABB is a leading provider of smart infrastructure solutions for various applications, and Johan will discuss how ABB helps develop smart cities in ASEAN. And finally, but not least, our lady member today, Stanemira Koleva. She is the Vice President and General Manager APAC for HERE Technologies. HERE Technologies provides mapping and location data, and Stanemira will elaborate on the role of big data and connectivity in urban cities. So without further ado, I'd like to go over to our panelists and start off with Igor. A bit of a teaser for you today, and we hope that we can get some discussion going, so it's not just a question and answer. And please, panelists, please feel free to come in. A teaser for you, Igor. How does your day look like compared to the time before the pandemic? And also, if you can bring in, because you are the bridge on the political side between Europe and ASEAN. From your perspective, how does the understanding of sustainable infrastructure differ between the EU and ASEAN? We can't actually hear you, Igor. Have you got your? It's not showing on mute, but no, I don't think. Igor, we can't hear you, so maybe we're going to have to fix the mic problem. And yeah, we'll have to move on. Sorry about that, Igor. It's really good that you managed to get in, but still the technology is fated. So let me move over then to JT and pose a question to JT. I know that your office seeks to support Asia's infrastructure development by harnessing the capabilities in Singapore. And I know that you have had many discussions with different governments around ASEAN. How to you has COVID-19 affected infrastructure development in ASEAN? And if in particular you could maybe focus on the funding which is being given now and in the future probably a bit less, bearing in mind the uncertainties of all aspects of political, social and economic.
Sure. Hi, thank you, Martin. Hi, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for a very question. I think that Infrastructure Asia, as just now I think you have introduced, we are a Singapore government body, and we have been looking at this region, trying to see how we can better assist the regional government in structuring and finally implementing their infrastructure project. I mean, as we all know, the demand for infrastructure in Asia is very huge. Many reports that you have seen, whether it's by the Asian Development Bank or the Global Infrastructure Hub, indicates that the amount of infrastructure that's needed in this region is tremendous. They're talking about more than $1 trillion per annum. This is driven by rapid urbanization as well as population growth. However, due to this large requirement, you also see that the issues and challenges of urbanization has become clearer and in many large cities. Just now you have mentioned, rapid urbanization has led to traffic congestion, reduced green spaces, and as well as increased waste generation. And that is, to me, a very important important challenges that's happening. Therefore, I think that the demand for infrastructure, whether it is pre-COVID or post-COVID, it will continue on. But I also see that there will be further emphasis on certain segments of infrastructure. And I believe that this will include public health infrastructure, supply chain, and especially maybe green energy. COVID-19 has placed a lot of emphasis on the importance of public health infrastructure. It has further highlighted the need for access to clean water, proper waste, solid and liquid waste management. This is because efficient waste management is crucial for a city to grow sustainably, given how ineffective waste management leads to unsanitary and unhealthy living conditions. Therefore, I think that post-pandemic, there will be a greater emphasis and greater push by various governments across the region towards public health infrastructure. And I believe that countries will also start to strengthen supply chain as well as logistics. COVID-19 has actually highlighted the need to increase resilience in the supply chain and diversify sources of supply. Digitalization and automation to improve supply chain efficiency would increase. We have already seen many firms, some of my fellow counterparts in this particular panel, using digitalization and automation to improve supply chain. We have seen firms using drones for managing inventory, automated guided vehicles to move goods. And I believe that digital connectivity will increasingly becoming a focus. And digital trade platforms, which improve agility through faster custom clearance, will be more prevalent. Last but not least, I think that COVID-19 has also resulted in a drop in energy demand. I think COVID-19 is a public health pandemic, but a lot of the solutions that government is implementing actually has an impact on the economy. Therefore, an IEA report recently projects that energy demand will actually drop 6% in 2020. Lockdown measures, however, are driving the shift towards clean energy, including wind, solar, as well as hydropower. Consequently, I think that coal-fired power plant will find themselves caught between low power demand and increasing production from clean energy. I mean, Infrastructure Asia, we've been talking to a lot of our supply-side partners in the past 2 months to 3 months, and they have echoed these sentiments. From my conversation with a lot of the debt and equity financiers in the last couple of months, we see that they continue to be keen on renewable or clean energy, and a lot of these infrastructure funds actually have dry powder to deploy in this time into clean energy. So I think overall, COVID-19 will have further reaffirmed the importance of public health infrastructure, supply chain management, and also other forms of cleaner energy. I think that will be one of the critical impact of COVID-19.
Okay, thank you, JT, for those views. I hear some squeaking now from Igor. I think we do have. Just check if we can hear you. Yeah.
Okay. Hi, Martin. Again. Yeah.
Here am I.
Great. So much for digitalization.
There we go. But we can hear you now. So maybe you want to make a comment to my opening question to you, which was on the political side between ASEAN and Europe. How does the understanding of sustainable infrastructure differ between the two?
Sure. Well, maybe for starters, in terms of definition, I think we would have a very wide definition of sustainable infrastructure. That would be infrastructure that is economically sustainable and fiscally, so market efficiency and as I say, fiscally viable, environmentally sustainable, promote decarbonization of the economy and respect high standards based on environmental impact assessment, as well as being socially sustainable, and impact an element that is sometimes a little bit forgotten. So high standards of transparency also on that score. So it's a infrastructure that is supported by the necessary rules and regulations in terms of non-discrimination and a level playing field for business. Think about procurement processes and so on and so forth. Now, we do have a specific policy you might be familiar with, which the new European Commission has been rolling out. That is the European Green Deal. And I think many people are familiar with the kind of target that the EU has set for itself, that is to be climate neutral in 2050. So reduce the net emissions of CO2 to zero by that date. But basically, there's a wide set of specific targets and actions that cut across many of the sectors that are related to sustainable infrastructure. One example is the decarbonization of the energy sector. That means the right technologies and infrastructure, but it also means the right interconnections and being able, for example, for renewable energy to connect to the grid. A second point is, of course, the renovation of buildings to help people cut their energy bills and energy use. We know that buildings consume around 40% of our energy. And finally, also important in respect to sustainable infrastructure is the rollout of cleaner, cheaper, and healthier forms of private and public transport. So really, it's a set of actions that will be required across our economy to reach that goal that we have set for ourselves. And I would think, obviously it's better for ASEAN to speak for ASEAN, but I think globally speaking, we do have somewhat of a different working method in the EU as compared to ASEAN. We work with legislation. For example, the legislation to become climate neutral in 2020 is currently being debated in the European Parliament. There's also a very strong European budget that's supposed to back up, for example, all these measures that I've been talking about, while ASEAN is obviously a much more intergovernmental institution and regional organization. But this set aside, in some of the goals, I think we do come together. If I look at the master plan on ASEAN infrastructure and its rolling pipeline, or the ASEAN sustainability urbanization strategy with toolkits for local governments, for example. So I think in terms of the policies, we're actually rather close often, but in terms of the working method, we do sometimes differ.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Igor. And I want to bring in now our private sector side, and also just carrying on with that theme. Johan, I mean, ABB is builder of big infrastructure projects. Maybe you could tell us what is your interface like to the public sector, and do you see a change in those technologies now post-COVID?
Thanks, Martin. Yes, I think one of the things that COVID-19 has very clearly reminded us of is that we build infrastructure for people, and at the end of the day, the goal is to have smart people, happy, engaged, productive, yeah, so that they can drive economic growth and that they're healthy. So, you know, that there's, you know, the sustainability aspect, that we're driving productivity without consuming the earth around us and making it an unhappy place to be. I completely agree with all the trends that have been shared already, and we see exactly that there is an acceleration, and we already see an acceleration of the rollout of infrastructure. I think partly because it's always been a priority. There is this deficit in ASEAN, and if we want to keep anywhere near the same growth rates, we've got to be investing in infrastructure. But I think also as part of keeping economies going and driving economic activity, infrastructure development is a great way to do it. It's a good way to spend government money because you get people engaged and at the same time leave some great legacy. In terms of the technologies, I can only echo what has been shared by several other speakers, is the role of digitalization. So whether we are building a power grid or you know, water infrastructure, water generation through desalination, or cleaning water or pumping water, or I mean, all of it is now more and more digitalized. So all these assets, all the equipment that we put in there, firstly, the decisions of where to put this infrastructure, what capacity, is much more data driven. And there's a lot more sources of data that help those decisions and make better decisions. And then the way in which we operate this infrastructure, you think about buildings, think about rail networks, public transport networks. Data is incredibly valuable in determining what interventions are the most valuable, where's the low-hanging fruit. We're involved with setting up data centers, which is obviously directly related to that. So in all the countries in ASEAN, we see a focus on the criticality of data, of digital infrastructure, and that's developing at a rapid pace.
Well, that's a brilliant, fantastic lead into Stanimira. I mean, here technologies, you ooze data. That's how you work, and I know that you collect a lot of data, be it traffic, weather, or what have you. What kind of changes in the patterns do you see in ASEAN since the movement restrictions have been introduced?
Yeah, thanks, Martin. I think we all see them. I mean, if I look at our real-time traffic services, you can see that the traffic is much less congested on the main roads, while we see e-commerce and deliveries taking on. And that also imposes very interesting challenges to our technology capability to help people navigate and drive in the last mile, find addresses easily. I see lots of requests coming from delivery companies to optimize their routing with multiple deliveries on the way. Patterns are changing in the way we live differently in these crisis days. I do expect that after COVID, we will also see change or reconfiguring of some of the traffic patterns. I see more and more companies reconsidering at least portion of their employees working from home permanently. That would inevitably affect, the moves in and out. But the last thing I would like to say here is that during this crisis, I think it's more than ever clear that we need to create services that allow emergency and safety response to be there and to be dynamic and to be agile, which can be delivered in a much better way in shorter times with more adaptive patterns if we use technology and we are digitalized across different systems, which is the great vision there. And the other thing we see is we really need to work towards mobility as a service in urban mobility solutions, and not just investing in ride-hailing, for example, which is going to boom, as we know, it's in the next few years, but really in multimodal transportation, and then coordinate and orchestrate across different modes of orchestration. And you see that there is a dynamic and rapid changes in terms of multimodal transportation traffic.
Thank you, Stanimira. And just to remind you all, please put your questions into the question and answer box online, so we can take some of those questions from there. Back to you, JT, and building on what we're talking about, digitalization and using digital tools for customs clearances. How do you think governments and the private sector can work better to ensure digitalization can really work? Because customs is still, we see across the region, very, very slow in introducing new tech-savvy ideas.
On the whole, I think that just now Ambassador have mentioned that Europe, for example, is very different from ASEAN. So within ASEAN, the mode of working and all that is very different. But I think that what we can do together is that both ASEAN leaders as well as businesses should combine forces and work together through many multilateral as well as bilateral platforms that have been set in place. I mean, an example is the ASEAN Smart City Network, or even just now, as Ambassador mentioned, the ASEAN connectivity initiatives that has been developed. I just give an example. Just last week, Infrastructure Asia just organized a session together with the ASEAN Secretariat, really on projects to discuss in the connectivity initiatives. And participants included the LIPSI representatives, the multilateral banks, which form a very important component, World Bank, ADB, AIIB. The private sector participated very proactively as well, and this includes the banking institutions, the infrastructure funds, as well as developers of infrastructure projects. To me, such brainstorm platform in which we can bring both the public as well as the private sector together to find new and better solutions would be critical to drive the sustainable initiatives and develop more infrastructure, whether be it in the connectivity space or be it in the transportational space. And I think this is an effort that Infrastructure Asia will continue to harness, how to bring the collective capabilities of both the private sector network as well as the public sector together for brainstorming session, as well as to see how the challenges and issues can be resolved together. I think that's a very important aspect. Similarly, for ASEAN, it's still a bit different, and capacity building as well as cross-sharing of knowledge is something that's critical. Another initiative that Infrastructure Asia is working together with the World Bank Group is the development of certain capacity building program. It will be specially created for government officials, and then, of course, the basics of how PPP are delivered, how international finance can be brought in, and what are some of the new and innovative technologies that can be applied together. I think working together on platforms, bring the private sector, the public sector together, cross-sharing of knowledge would be important to drive this agenda.
Okay, thank you, JT. We've got some questions coming into the app. So let me start with not an easy one for you, Igor, but it's directed to you and maybe Johan. There have been exciting trends both in EU and ASEAN region on sustainable finance and business human rights. How do you see the EU policies on non-financial reporting directive, which is the NFRD, and mandatory human rights due diligence, I won't say that acronym, strengthen EU-ASEAN partnerships on sustainable infrastructure? Have you got that one? Igor, you're on mute, yeah? Not
yeah.
really.
Well, I was hoping I could take a minute to think about that while but I don't have that luxury. Listen, I don't have the exact answer to the specific question there, but I think it's rather clear to everybody that for us, human rights is part and parcel of just about anything that we do. And I spoke earlier about some of the social standards that we try to uphold, some of the environmental standards that we try to uphold. And definitely human rights is one of those issues that we abide by at any time. So, you know, when we speak about our way of doing things, just human rights is at the very center. But as to the specifics of that question, I would need to check.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Another one. Sorry, Johan. Yes, please. Yeah, please.
I can add something. I mean, that's an incredibly important topic for us. And when you're developing infrastructure or you're involved in infrastructure development, in much of the developing world, it means that you're involved in very large projects in markets that are not developed yet and which doesn't have the institutions and all the mechanics and machinery to safeguard people and so on. So I think as European companies, we have a massive contribution to make in these markets. I don't think that's a reason to stay out, but it is absolutely a reason to go and apply our principles diligently, and that has been our experience. We have a very thorough risk review process to make sure we're not negatively impacting or contributing to human rights issues. We very particularly screen for that. But just being active in the market and driving to certain standards, that we really do see that shift the market. We've seen that with our safety standards. Our customers have adopted the safety standards that we apply in these projects. We've seen that with compliance and integrity standards and turning back business, refusing to be involved in anything that's not done compliantly. So just to say that infrastructure, and having gone through the mill and having learned some expensive lessons, I think we can make a very valuable contribution as we develop infrastructure in developing countries.
Mm-hmm. And just from an interest point of view, Johan, in that, being a big MNC, what is it then that you see as a company a benefit to you in getting involved in such infrastructure projects when there are so many hurdles or that you have to overcome?
Absolutely. Well, I mean, the first thing is this is what we do. So, you know, when we started working in Myanmar, I can tell you we turned down 50% of the opportunities for business just because of where things were. And that comes with a high overhead. But in the long term, it's worth it because you build trust, you build relationships, and you prepare the ground for more and more, how can I say, efficient business in that market. And we definitely have seen appreciation for that. What is so ironic is when there is, let's say, companies that operate incompliantly or not with the right safety standards, that always comes at a cost. And in the long run, when you're doing it the proper way, we are in the end more cost effective that way because everything else adds to your cost. So it's been worth our while to do this.
Mm-hmm. Good, thank you. A second one, again, for Igor. It was just mentioning about 40% of the world's energy construction. You mentioned given the heightened awareness of the imperative for sustainable construction and the adoption of modern standards everywhere, is there anything that stands out in ASEAN in these areas that the European Union could learn from and weave into the rollout of the new EU Green Deal, which I think is very important, yeah?
Thank you very much, Martin. Well, maybe I can give you one example of a dialogue that we've been having with ASEAN for quite a number of years now, and that concerns the so-called Eurocodes. So that's 10 European standards providing a common approach for the structural design of buildings and other civil engineering. So that mainly is to ensure that buildings, be them or bridges or pipelines, are stable, safe, don't catch fire, or are resistant to earthquakes. But there's also an element in there in terms of energy savings. And we're now updating these Eurocodes to ensure that they're also compliant with the European Green Deal. That's if you see that the current Eurocodes have been adopted in at least 3 ASEAN countries, we hope that while we advance and while we reflect on how to adapt the Eurocodes, that is something that, again, ASEAN could adopt as well, so that we have common standards, which I think is always useful for any business.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Building on the big data, this one's for Stanimira. It's often quite a buzzword that we use these days, yet many might not fully understand its meaning. Could you elaborate on the role of big data in smart city projects and how Southeast Asian economies can better promote data-driven cities?
Yeah, thanks, Martin. Yeah, it is, as you said, it is often used term, and it refers to our ability to process big volumes of various types of data. I think the biggest driver for exponential increase in the amount of data today is the adoption of Internet of Things, as we call it, or rather large scale proliferations of various sensors which are connected. And that also drives with the instant availability of compute and storage power that the cloud services make available these days, that now creates a completely new platform for contributing smartness to the city infrastructure and the city services. There are many challenges that we need to resolve, and I would probably think the compute and storage part of the big data is probably the least of them. The connectivity between different data systems is still very limited. They live in silos. There is a lot of data, but they live in silos, physical silos and format silos and standard silos, which is a challenge. Government need to play a major role in terms of data exchange and providing real-time, trustworthy, correct data, which is easily accessible for business and institutions. That overlaid with models, and we know these days artificial intelligence is powering a number of solutions. It will continue to be. I mean, there are studies showing that artificial intelligence will become actually the new user interface. And players like us who provide the location aspect of data are seeing a major proliferation of use cases which we can empower completely new capabilities, where we could correlate data to location and timing and help models, help planning around infrastructure, help planning around the city, help orchestration of traffic, or multimodal types of transportation to achieve reduction of pollution in the city. Real-time data being processed, real-time and pushed out as a decision in terms of services capability enables many new ways of intelligently managing the transport in the city and creating access to completely new capabilities.
Thank you, Stanimira. So we're getting quite a few questions to do with sustainability development goals. I'd like to head these ones towards JT. It really is about when it comes to planning for infrastructure beyond environmental ones, And if we look at Sustainable Development Goal framework for prioritizing infrastructure projects, as a basis of this, it's been mentioned about the Myanmar Sustainable Development Plan, mapped to support its project bank listing, for example. Can you comment on those? How effective you think they are, JT?
So maybe let me just touch on maybe just covering one other point that I think some of both Johan and Igor was mentioning just now. I think within ASEAN itself, actually the between sustainable goals as well as basic infrastructure that have to be developed, actually ASEAN is doing quite a lot in this particular area. Increasingly, you also see a lot of ASEAN countries moving towards a better states of transparency and a better states of governance. Of course, I am pretty sure that the level at which ASEAN is in now will be some way to reach the European level. But I think the trend, the projectile, is that within ASEAN itself, increasingly more and more ASEAN countries are trying to move towards a playing field where it's more transparent and there's more governance that's being put in. I mean, within Infrastructure Asia, when we engage the regional government, whether it's the Myanmar government, whether it's the Cambodian government, increasingly we see that they are trying to adhere to international standards. They are trying to move towards a level playing field and a more adherence to global governance, global international standards. And I think progressively, increasingly, that will be the pathway that ASEAN will be taking. And I think in the longer term, there will be more and more projects that is coming out of ASEAN that adheres to all these international rules.
Okay. So this one I throw open, and it's a few questions around PPP. Given the tightening of the availability of government funding, how else can the private sector work with the public sector to help with the funding and planning of infrastructure projects? And in specific, we know that PPP structures are increasingly avoided in many contexts because of their shortcomings, and that was specifically mentioned about or publicized in Australia. Yet PPPs seem to be the focus for ASEAN infrastructure. How to develop PPPs that avoid the concerns or issues that have become evident, rather than replicating them and doing the same mistakes? Anybody able to or feeling they want to?
maybe again, yeah. if you don't mind. So actually, I mean, if you look at the situation currently, the regional countries, whether it's ASEAN or even globally, everybody is suffering from the current pandemic. And just now, as I mentioned, a lot of it has now turned into an economic problem whereby industry, manufacturing activities, and all that are going down. So that's why a lot of government fiscal stimulus is actually put into protecting jobs, and a lot of money is actually put in all this. So now, where do you going to get the money to actually develop infrastructure projects? And I think that is where the private sector can actually come in. There is an emphasis on PPP, I think somewhat you're just mentioning, but I guess what exactly is PPP? I mean, it is similar to smart city. So there are thousands of definitions of what a smart city is. Similarly, what exactly does PPP means? So from a very basic perspective for infrastructure, if infrastructure projects can be developed with the assistance of the public sector side, the private sector side, and our participation from both, and a project is actually developed up which can be executed, I think that to me constitute a PPP project. Of course, there will be multiple definitions on that. So how can we do better? To me, just now, I think to some extent I've mentioned that cross-sharing platforms, cross-sharing of knowledge is something that's critical. Capacity building is critical as well. So that was why just now when I mentioned the ASEAN connectivity project that we were doing together with the Myanmar side, we actually brought in both the public sector, the private sector, the multilaterals to really brainstorm on what exactly is needed to make the project viable. And I think that type of platforms is absolutely critical to enable private sector to participate in some of these projects.
Thanks for that, JT. And I'd just like to bring in Igor on this one. And if he feels that EU can help out in any way in the financing, is there any schemes that are happening there?
Thank you, Martin. Well, we have adopted a new financing rather recently. It was announced, I think, at the beginning of this year, some 50 million euros in grant, the ASEAN Green Finance Facility, and that will be topped up by loans from the major European development banks as well as the European investment banks. So that will be quite a bit of capital there to do exactly what we've been talking about. The focus will be definitely on green infrastructure, from renewable energy to public transport to railways, you name it. But we hope that in the coming years that we can actually roll that out and come to a good pipeline of projects, and that we can also plug in the private sector in that discussion.
And thank you, Igor. I've got another one which I think is directly to you, if I can just slip this one in. Do you believe that governments will include sustainability conditions in their bailout or stimulus programs in the future?
Well, I can only speak about the European Union. Basically, it's true that a lot of the money now goes to say people who are temporarily unemployed or saving some of the airlines and so on and so forth. But the debate in Europe is very much focused on the next financial cycle, the so-called multi-annual financial framework. And the proposal that is currently being discussed in Europe is one whereby we would establish a European recovery fund. Big debate on how many percentage would be grants or loans or what to do with it. But what there seems to be a consensus about is that the focus of that money should very much be on supporting the Green Deal as well as digitalization. So the issues that I've been talking about at the beginning, when it comes to energy, renewable energy, when it comes to buildings, that type of thing, that would be the focus of that huge pot of money, because the stimulus money we can only spend it once, and I think it's important that we spend it wisely and ensure that we use this opportunity and the money that will be available to reboot the economy to do exactly that.
Thank you, Igor. Good, some great questions still coming in. So thank you very much for engaging with us. And this one I'll head over to our private sector. So for Johan and Stanimira to give some comment to. Competitiveness in pricing is essential for winning tenders. Companies from Europe frequently find themselves structurally at a disadvantage in Asia, especially when competitors profit from hidden or open financial state support, including through guarantees. Technologically competitive offers from the European companies may fall short of success due to a weaker financing side. How should EU companies deal with that? Maybe Johan for first comment. What's your experience?
I mean, there's a portion of infrastructure projects which, let's say, if I think everybody knows that if it comes with Japanese financing, then there is a very large component of Japanese companies also involved in the execution of those projects. And if we don't have a large footprint there, it's very difficult to participate in those projects, and it definitely lessens the competitiveness of, because it's not globally competitive bidding into those projects. They can still be successful, so I'm not making a comment about that, but that just to say that that is a fact. What has helped us tremendously is to really put roots down in all the countries and to build up a track record there. And we have seen this repeatedly in the developing countries in Southeast Asia is where there has been even state-owned companies that are competing against us. They may win once, but unfortunately, quality and reliability comes at a cost. And somewhere, the chickens come home to roost. And we have often seen, projects being cancelled when things break after 4 or 5 years. And, then the evaluation criteria changes. It includes reliability. And I've seen a very positive development of pre-qualifying suppliers. So there needs to be a track record. There needs to be the capability on the ground to service this installed base. So long story short, we've been able to do good, sustainable infrastructure business over several decades now in Southeast Asia. And we don't always win, but I am happy with the business that we do get. And it's absolutely possible to do it.
Mm-hmm. Stanimira, have you?
Yeah, and from the point of view of our business, and I fully agree with the observations, by the way. Obviously, if it is a product that we just want to take from Europe and sell the way it is in some of the markets in Southeast Asia, that probably doesn't work all the time. Our strategies are definitely to establish a wide network of partnerships, local partnerships with system integrators and providers, service providers that are able to then translate the technology to the local solution. And we do a whole heaps of local development, where we know that for some of the emerging markets, we need to adapt what product and what technology and how we present the technology as well. And so we tap into the local cost base, labor cost base as well as we get, just the investment we've made being present in all these markets makes us more aware of how to deal with the local regulation, some data security and privacy requirements, which affects our business as well. And various local, but the good news is, we operate in a location, and location by definition is local. So we need to have the local context.
Thank you. And to JT to bring it all together and comment on that as well. But I think there's something about quality versus price, which is the question for governments with tight purses. JT?
Sorry, the question again?
Now, to basically build on what Johan and Stanimira were saying from a private sector, which I think then comes all into the question of quality versus price, is a question for governments with tight purses.
So maybe let me, I think in the, where I was beginning, so I was just saying that, according to most reports that you see out there, the demand for infrastructure to drive economic growth in ASEAN, in Asia, especially in ASEAN, is tremendous. As I mentioned, you are looking at $1 trillion. Of course, this $1 trillion never materialized, but you're looking at $1 trillion every year. The market is huge. So the market is huge, and there are many players, whether European firms, Japanese, Chinese, and there are a lot of firms playing this particular area, but the market is huge enough to encompass everyone. And just now, as I mentioned, ASEAN itself is moving towards a trajectory in which transparency and governance plays an important part. So at the end of the day, I believe that firms that has good quality infrastructure, good quality solutions, they will benefit from the overall trajectory of where ASEAN countries are moving towards. Even now, most funds and all that you are seeing are going into good quality projects. So at the end of the day, I do believe that quality infrastructure and quality projects matters globally, and increasingly in ASEAN, quality will matters as well.
Okay, thank you. Again, we go to Igor, hitting on this topic of what does he believe what the EU can learn from ASEAN in terms of sustainable infrastructure. Igor.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot we can learn. Maybe one example would be on smart cities, the debate that we've been having. if you look at Singapore, but also other cities, is definitely there a lot that we can take inspiration from, and we're trying to develop a partnership between the Smart Cities Network in ASEAN with the equivalent in the European Union to share experience, to look at what works, look at what doesn't, look at some of the digital solutions that have been found in ASEAN cities, look at ICT, energy efficiency, and so on and so forth, mobility and transport. So definitely a lot to do on that score as one example.
Okay, thank you. And now, just getting some other ones in. How to ensure supply chains for infrastructure development meet environmental and social goals? Does the panel believe that there is any role for tech in here, or for governments in setting standards maybe around materials that are used? Because obviously we know that concrete is a huge source of greenhouse gases, and one of the main constituents in those infrastructure projects. Any comments? Open it to anybody.
Yeah, let me perhaps start. I would probably approach it from a point of view of how sustainability can be linked to an intelligent and well-configured supply chain. And we earlier touched upon that, and there is an environmental and sustainability aspect to it. In intelligent management of supply chain, where not just the price matters, but also other factors like transportation and the greenhouse effects that have been associated with it have to be considered. There is a role for the government in terms of stimulus and regulation around it. And we see a lot of push coming now with waste reduction regulation coming into place, etc. But there is quite a lot that we can do by not just by planning, but constantly striving towards real-time management and optimization around supply chain.
Okay, thanks, Stanimira. Anybody want to add to that? Otherwise, I think...
This JT here, can I just add one point to this? I think just now, as I mentioned, supply chain, I think, will be getting increasing prominence post-pandemic. Because if you look at supply chain prior to this, there is a lot of emphasis being put on efficiency. How efficient is that supply chain? And what happened when you try to squeeze in a lot of efficiency? That means that a lot of redundancy is being removed from the entire supply chain. But what this pandemic has caused is that now resilience become as important as efficiency. So in order to have resilience, you need to ensure that there's redundancy. You need to ensure that the data of the supply chain is incorporated, and you need to understand how to you need to diversify your supply chain. But in order for you to diversify your supply chain, you need to have the data in the first place. So I think that moving forward in supply chain management, efficiency will continue to be important because that's what supply chain fundamentals are. But resilience become very important as well. And that is where a lot of data, a lot of technology will have to be incorporated.
Thank you very much, JT. And wow, amazing how 1 hour flies by. Really thank you to everybody for joining us today on our webinar. Really thank you for all the panelists for your depth of experience and knowledge and answering the questions, even though at times quite tricky. I'd just like to pose to each of you in a way of finishing one question and then just go around everybody. And that question is, what one action would each of you like to see to further accelerate the sustainable infrastructure? Maybe we start off with Johan.
Thanks, Martin. One action, I mean, maybe I'll just pick up on this last topic that we discussed, is it has to be in the specifications. So we need to look at life cycle cost of infrastructure. This is stuff that needs to last for 30 or 40 years and has an enormous energy or carbon footprint over this lifespan of infrastructure. So I'd really like to see that. And we see this when reputable financial institutions are involved, typically you get better quality specifications. But the fact is that we are bidding for projects now with a specification that was written in the 1980s in some cases, and it just hasn't been updated to accommodate for if I can just add one small thing to that, is in the private sector, we often have an opportunity to offer value add. So if you have a technology solution that's not specified but can bring a tremendous difference, that can be evaluated, and there's a proper evaluation to safeguard, that it's always in the best interest of the people that it serves. We don't see that in infrastructure projects and government projects yet in most of the places, and that's a great opportunity.
Okay, thank you, Johan. And to JT, what one would you like to see in the future?
I think what I want to see is already happening. If it could be accelerated, I think it would be better, because there are quite a lot of capital that is focused on sustainability now. I mean, I give an example. Within Singapore itself, just last year, we have about $4.5 billion of green bonds that was issued internationally through Singapore. And that is already, because at the end of the day, capital does matter. And capital that's focused on sustainability will drive that particular push towards sustainable infrastructure much better. It's happening, but I hope that it could be accelerated even more.
Thank you. Stanimira.
Yeah, my one would be really see a much more by design and focused enablement of data exchange and transparency and common standards and data sharing across a wide ecosystem of players. I believe that could deliver quite a lot of positive effects on sustainability.
Thank you. And last but not least, Igor from Jakarta.
Maybe a slightly broader action, so to speak, would be for governments, all of them, European, Asian, all of them, to maybe be bit slightly smarter in the way that we invest in infrastructure, and to think twice before decisions are made, and to really make the public investment in those infrastructures that are truly sustainable, and not go for the short-term solutions.
Thank you very much, and I think a very great way to finish this panel. Thank you, and back to you, Chris.
Thank you, Martin. Thank you, everybody, for your contributions today. Johan, JT, Stanimira, and of course, Igor. Martin, thank you for some very good moderation. We have more webinars coming up in the near future, so please look out for those. This one will be posted out on our website and other social platforms tomorrow for anybody who wanted to recap it. And with that, I wish you all a good evening or a good rest of your day in Europe, and keep safe, everybody. Thank you very much.
Thank you.